Okay, before we start, I'm delighted and honored to welcome Marjorie Goodwin today at our conference. It is a great pleasure to have such a renowned keynote speaker. But I wanted to say that, of course, your work and the work of Chuck doesn't need to be introduced, but I wanted to say that for our Russian-speaking community, it has an additional significance and additional meaning, because yours work and the work of Chuck has opened to us. We've been to multimodality research for a lot of people who are now with us today. And I wanted to share a personal story. When I was a student at the university, and we had a class on social anthropology, and our teacher gave the definition of society, which I remember by my heart. And now he said that society is how we are friends to one another. And I really liked this definition. And why I'm telling this, I wanted to say, Candy, that you and your Cooperative Action Lab for us are a way to be not only researchers, but to be a part of a community. And this community is a loving community. And I love it so much about it, that it's not only about science, it's about the ways of relating to one another, of making sense and making friends and so on. And it is so valuable. So I'm really glad that you are here today, and I open the floor to you. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you so much, Maria. And it's just been so much fun to interact with you and Niels and Mikhail as part of the lab, and your generous comments that you provide to people during the presentations. It is really the way to be a community. I agree with you so much.
A community of practice.
Thank you for giving me this opportunity to speak today, and I look forward to people's comments. And I'm so glad to meet all the other members of your community in your Russian community. So it's a real pleasure for me today. So I guess I'll share my screen and get started. Just a minute. Okay, can we have all the people on the side are kind of there. Maybe it's, I don't know, do people see all the faces? Can you see the entire screen? Do you think it's better? I don't know. How do you see things?
I can see everything perfectly. There is a presentation of the faces on my right-hand side.
Okay, but what I'm saying is, will the faces obscure what's on the screen is what I'm asking.
No, there's no gray shadow.
No.
It's all fine.
Everything's fine.
Okay. But can you see everything that's on the screen on mine?
Yeah.
I see people's faces on the side. Oh, okay. Okay, great then. All right. So here goes. In this talk, we're going to be concerned with the lived practices through which a cancer patient inhabits the end of life. The focus is on a doctor's care of his dying patient and the patient's interaction with his doctor and community of students and colleagues. And here, what I'm reporting on is work that I'm doing now in close collaboration with Dr. Federica Raia, who's PI of this project, and Dr. Mario Deng. The project is Living Towards Death, and it was initiated to study the course of interaction between a cardiologist, Dr. Mario Deng, and his patient, advanced heart failure patient, Charles Goodwin. With the pandemic, the ability to plan, to touch one's family members, or to engage in many of the small rituals through which life attains meaning become attenuated. Often family members don't have the opportunity to say goodbye to their loved ones. Families can't even gather in person to mourn the loss of their loved ones. People in the US have little experience talking openly about death. Doctors such as Atul Gawande, who write about their practice, have said that their training seriously lacked any focus on how to talk about death. He says, I learned about a lot of things in medical school, but mortality wasn't one of them. Our textbooks had almost nothing on aging or frailty or dying, how the process unfolds, how people experience the end of their lives, and how it affects those around them seemed beside the point. The way we saw it and the way our professors saw it, the purpose of medical school was to teach how to save lives, not how to tend to their demise. But I want to report on a different kind of experience approaching the end of life, where intimacy was possible and talk about death was quite open. And this is in large part due to the fact that Chuck, my husband, came to be cared for by a doctor who practices relational medicine. Also, Chuck, who first had heart failure and then eye melanoma, didn't die suddenly, but was able to plan for his death over a 2-year period. And during this time, he learned to approach dying with a sense of equanimity. So what I'm going to present is an ethnography of experiencing, or as Chuck would say, inhabiting death that involved not only a caring doctor, but also a community of students and colleagues. This is a longitudinal account of the process through which Chuck was able to, from Maynard's perspective, progressively adjust to an altered social world and undergo metamorphosis. We first knew about Dr. Deng when in Chuck's cooperative action lab, Federica Raia, a phenomenologist and professor of education at UCLA, brought tapes of Dr. Deng, her partner, teaching and performing heart biopsies. He's the attending physician in this image. And it happened one day that Chuck was so weak because of his heart condition that he had to leave the seminar lying on the floor of his lab. So then Federica suggested that he might want to go and see her partner, Dr. Mario Deng, a cardiologist. And that was the beginning of a collaborative adventure, a friendship that entailed all 4 of us in the process of documenting Chuck's process of understanding how to deal with death as a part of living. And Chuck, Mario, and I attended Federica's classes on phenomenology together too. For advanced heart failure doctors, the starting and returning point is the patient in his or her life. Similar to other high-tech medicine, as Raia and Deng explain in their book, Relational Medicine, advanced heart failure patients, family caregivers, and healthcare practitioners collaborate closely in a lifelong relationship, needing to confront complex decisions regarding treatment and death. And so Chuck and I became part of this study. In an informal conversation in March of 2018, Dr. Deng was explaining the basic premise of his practice. He says, "It is the way I feel the practice of medicine should be, where we all encounter each other as persons, where the basic human right of being a person, the right and responsibility of being a person for me in my illness condition, translates into the right and responsibility of the other, the healthcare professional, to be also that as a person, which implies that we're here for now, but not for eternity in the classical sense." He's always bringing up the inevitability of death in his talk to people. So the notion of care, as Raia explains, is based on Heidegger. Our being in the world is essentially based on care. The idea that who we are is always positioned vis-a-vis others in the world, and that our existence is an issue for us. It matters for us. But the advanced heart failure doctor, care means helping the patient to develop a new sense of self and a meaningful sense of life in the process of becoming. So we've talked a little bit about Mario, but not Chuck. So I want to discuss what he said in an interview on Reflections on Retirement in 2017 in Anthropology News, when he was asked, "What class did you enjoy teaching the most and why?" And he responded like this: "My absolute joy during 40 years of teaching has been my seminars. These are really chances to explore analysis with whole cohorts of incredibly interesting people, both students and years of visitors. I've learned so much from all these colleagues. And in addition, he enjoyed his weekly lab where people presented videotape materials of interaction that they were working on. When he was asked what he saw as the most important contributions, he talked about his work on the social life of aphasia. His father had a stroke in his early 60s that left him with a 3-word vocabulary, yes, no, and, but he nevertheless remained for the rest of his life an incredibly powerful speaker. Chuck felt that showing people what chill could do was important for opening people's minds to the varieties of ways of being human. And many times during his illness, Chuck expressed that his ability to carry on in the face of terminal cancer was in part influenced by his father's example. His father accepted his condition of global aphasia, not trying to change it, and had an active life for 19 years after his stroke. Despite his disability, he refused to let things get him down. So then when Dr. Deng asked Chuck if he'd like to participate in the project on advanced heart care doctor-patient interaction and be taped, there was no hesitation because we spent our life documenting other people and actually being part of the interactions many times as well. So Dr. Raia, Deng, Chuck, and I embarked on a project that was entitled Living Towards Death, which was documenting the course of Chuck's interactions with Dr. Deng over 2 years, with over 30 recordings, 1 hour or more in length, in various different locations in the hospital, at dinners. He was the consummate linguistic anthropologist with his microphone and tape always with him. During phone calls, and then also email exchanges that Chuck had. And I was a participant in most of these. So for over 2 years, Dr. Deng cared not only for Chuck's medical concerns, but also his psychological concerns, including his fears about cancer and dying. And Dr. Deng was both a therapist and a palliative care doctor, helping Chuck from the very first interactions that we had there. Now, what's different about advanced heart failure patient care? One is the way that the doctor structures and opens the medical encounter, asking, "How's life?" This permits the patient to develop his own story about his condition. And in this cooperative journey in living towards death, this structure with this open-ended question permits the patient a more extended turn at talk. And the doctor can respond or comment in a variety of ways to the patient's narratives. These sessions often were an hour or more. And a second way that the encounter differs is that there's an incredible openness in talking about death. In our very first meeting with Dr. Deng in March 2016, 60 minutes into the meeting, after discussing the mechanisms, management, and prognosis of heart failure with preserved ejection fraction, Dr. Deng introduced talk about the inevitability of death, which was standard in his practice with his patients. So let's listen to what he had to say.
And then obviously, in terms of lifestyle changes to explore, there probably is a contributing aspect of a certain mindset that is already like, oh, things are going wrong direction, entering the second half of my life, and now things are spiraling down, self-fulfilling prophecy of now I have to be in high alert, high blood pressure, more resistance for the left ventricle, less filling, more shortness of breath, more anxiety. And can one get into that in a meaningful way? Yes, one can. And probably on the basis of the basic sense, living towards death in a basic sense, that it's unlikely that the three of us will be having this conversation 1,000 years from now, although the future is not completely predictable. And taking the uncertainty of what comes into consideration, and then being so appreciative and attentive to the here and nowness of ourselves, and not let any of that stuff really bother us that much, regardless of whether a department gets shut down or something else happens. And that kind of is an exercise to explore different ways of dealing with that.
So a year after that, what Chuck remembered was, I think one of the things that was good, the first time we met and you talked about getting the most out of our lives, mindfulness, and of adjusting to a situation where death is a definite reality. Discussions about death are uncommon, though, in medical encounters. Maynard reports, as doctors, nurses, patients, and caregivers work diligently to stave off death, conversations by which they address quality and end of life are at best infrequent and at worst non-existent. Knudsen explains that end-of-life discussions are rare and missed opportunities are common. And Pino and Perry report that experienced doctors withhold introducing end-of-life when they could and leave it up to the patients to volunteer discussion. So Chuck put into action the ideas that his doctor had prescribed: exercise, diet, meditation, and in 4 months, he passed a stress test with flying colors. But then on February 6th of the next year, 2017, on a visit to the ophthalmology clinic at UCLA, a large elevated lesion was found in the periphery of his left eye. It was diagnosed as choroidal eye melanoma with serious retinal detachment. And then 2 days later, after the diagnosis, Chuck had a routine scheduled appointment with his heart doctor, and Dr. Deng asked for an update on his eye since Chuck had immediately informed him of the cancer. And then after dealing with medical issues that were related to his heart condition, Chuck began to discuss how he was reacting to the news of his cancer. He presented his visceral reactions to what was going on, and he used metaphors that could powerfully allude to the intensity of the emotional reaction. So in response to Dr. Deng's question, so what's the update? Chuck provided the analogy of the phony war to describe how he was feeling. This is the period of October 1939 to March 1940, the early years of World War II, after the German conquest of Poland in September of 1939, where there was a time of no major hostilities, but a time of waiting, anxiety, and patience with little certainty of what was going on.
Okay, so about this, one way to say is, I haven't looked on the web or anything. The comparison, I think it's perhaps a good comparison, is the phony war at the beginning of World War II, when everybody knew the Germans were going to attack, but there was that period in Paris when nobody did. So I've just been sitting somewhat in a state of shell shock and not yet wanting to know the road we're about to venture on. I mean, I'm concerned, obviously, in many ways. I'm concerned about dying. I'm concerned about the nature of the treatments. Obviously, I don't know if I'll lose an eye, if I'm going to have an awful lot of chemo or something. And also, I realize I'm concerned for Candy.
So Chuck compares himself as someone waiting in limbo during the early years of World War II. There's no certainty what's going to happen with Chuck's eye. He's existing in a state of shell shock, and we can hear the aspiration and breathiness in his voice as he's talking to Dr. D. So in response to Chuck's story, Dr. D responds with a linked, or what Sachs calls a second story, that involved how his wife Federica felt when she discovered that she had breast cancer. That's exactly actually how Federica felt when she texted me and when I called. And then with his tied or second story, Dr. Deng appears as a character in a similar story of encountering the news of cancer, which hits suddenly and destructively like a bomb, and then dealing with the uncertainty of what's next.
Coming back to what you just said, and thank you for sharing that. It's just more on this, how it hits in kind of like a bomb, right?
Yeah.
That's what I've also felt, and that is what actually Federica felt when she texted me and when I called. It was just this. That's the first thing, and then you transform this into a plan, and that's ongoing. And obviously, we're here, so 24/7 to about this to talk about that. And so I think this uncertainty time is really difficult
Okay, so the linked our second story provides a kind of empathetic demonstration of Chuck's narrative, and it shows a demonstration of understanding of Chuck's narrative, and it shows that there are ways of dealing with transforming it into a plan. And when he says, obviously, we're here 24/7 about this, he provides assurance that he'll always be available for consultation. And in fact, he gives his patients his personal phone number. So in his lecture on conversation, Sachs states that with the tied or second story, the listener appears as a character in an event similar to the teller's. The telling of a similar experience can be a way of demonstrating or exhibiting understanding, confirming features of the told experience with the meaning you're not alone. And Sachs provided reference to Frieda von Reichmann in this lecture, noting the importance of careful listening as the most important skill of a psychoanalyst. 2 months later, when Chuck had an appointment, he uses metaphoric language to describe the way he experiences cancer as differing from heart failure. He frequently liked kayak metaphors, and he explains, whereas you could master practices relating to helping the heart by how you ate, exercised, this is not the case with cancer, which is inevitable, and you have to live with it and adapt you and your body to go with the cancer, as you would in kayaking go with the river.
Yeah. Well, a couple things on one you said. One, the most minor, and you could reject it. You talked about mastering the heart. I just, when I was kayaking, and one of the reasons I like kayaking, I realized that you don't master the river. It's more philosophy. The more you understand the river and then adapt you and your body to go with the river, the more skilled. And that seems a different metaphor for even what happens with the heart. I mean, I'm glad I gave up all that salt, and now I can live better because I'm riding with the actual stuff of my body in some sense.
So in response, Dr. D explains that melanoma is real. He affirms Chuck's idea that you cannot master it, and he tells a story about how his wife, Federica, experienced her cancer when there was no clear prognosis and she felt that she was near death with breast cancer. She felt herself being able to appreciate life at the absolute fullest, more than she ever had before.
And on that, you are not in any way away from melanoma, because that metaphor, which I've found you have been living in, it's not the master over, but living with, and that is the same with melanoma. I was amazed when Federica, I don't know if you remember her telling this, when she was diagnosed September 23, 15, and was taking the walks on the beach. There was this period where it was unclear which direction, where she was so intensely alive, feeling intensely alive, that she, number one, felt after the perspective became clear, okay, lumpectomy, nodectomy, radiation, hormone therapy, that she was deprived of an intensity of being that she was missing. The trade-off.
So confronting death with this uncertainty had worked to heighten her senses. When she knew she was recovering from various therapies, she didn't feel the same intensity of living. And Dr. D provides a way of framing things by telling about his wife in a similar situation and how she'd become even more alive. And so Chuck was quite open about his cancer. He regularly wrote to his colleagues and lab members, updating them about his illness. And when he found out that he had the worst possible form of melanoma, he wrote a colleague contrasting his experiences of interacting with the oncologist and those interacting with his heart doctor. So the last diagnosis was brutal. This is the oncologist. I felt the doctor was a skilled technician, which is important, but not able to see what was happening from our perspective. So I know that there, and he says that he knew that there were 2 stages in breast cancer, for example. So when I asked how many stages there were, he seemed exasperated and by my stupidity. There are only 2 stages, he said. Then accepting it, I asked, what were the possibilities for cure? And again, surprised by my ignorance, he said, this cancer doesn't get cured. So we were given truly shocking news, and after an hour sent back out to the street to deal with it ourselves. And this was quite different from what happened with Mario. When Mario diagnosed my heart failure, he spent a long time talking with Candy and me and saying that what we should do is focus on making the most of our time that we had left. And what he said was the most important medical advice I ever received. I consider him a healer rather than a doctor, a healer who can guide his patients to live in the shadow of death. And I'm sure that this is what got me through my heart failure, he says. Okay. So then he writes to his students, we'll meet tomorrow, bad news. And talks about how this is a kind of, he has stage 2 cancer, which is the worst possible, and it's unlikely to be cured. And then students reflected later on this note that Chuck had sent them, talking about the meaning with it. And he said that Chuck was sharing his thinking about his options and why a diagnostic procedure had little appear. His emphasis was clearly on living. And then she says that the same winter, my mother was diagnosed with terminal cancer, and my younger brother had massive stroke that left him almost in a coma. Chuck's messages that year helped me with my anger, showing that I have to be more intentional about living. In particular, I think the subject line, we'll meet tomorrow, bad news, summed up Chuck's perspective. Despite the news, Chuck wanted to hold a seminar, and she wonders what she would do. Then it made me cause to think about how wasteful it was to be angry and to feel sorry for myself, regardless of what happens. I learned that I had to work on making bigger spaces for the things in my life I value, since we're all living towards dying, but at different scales. Okay, then on April 21st, when Chuck visits Dr. Deng, he provides some more metaphors on how he's interpreting death at the moment. He's been reading King Lear, which invokes fear, but also Midsummer's Night's Dream, which is joyful. And then he moves on to talking about ghosts and skeletons.
I had another weird thought of dying. Maybe it's not as much, but I had 2 things that happened. One night when I got very anxious about the things coming back, I remembered King Lear, which is perhaps the most devastating, unremitting picture ever written. But then lately, what I've been reading is A Midsummer's Night's Dream, and which is joyful. But then the other thing that what was it? The other thing that I recalled was how much we treat dead people as terrible, like ghosts and skeletons and everything. And it's like, I've got my passport into a helmet cold.
Whoops. Whoops, I'm suddenly not able to, oh, there, okay. So the Day of the Dead was really important in our lives. We'd been to Day of the Dead ceremonies in Oaxaca in 1985 after my father died, because we wanted to understand how culture other than our own deal with death. And this experience had a very powerful impact on our ways of thinking and approaching death. So here we're going to see the way in which Chuck is contrasting the way death is dealt with in the US with how it's embraced in Mexico.
You know, in a way, we shouldn't treat the dead so terrible. It made me think of the Day of the Dead in Mexico, where people go to talk on their dead.
Yeah. Yes.
That seemed healthier.
Yes.
Because we have participated with everybody.
Yes.
And not that I believe in ghosts or afterlife, but it should be that there's this continuity
Yes.
But as you can see,
Okay, then he explains that he's been trying to keep a tight grip on things that have become very emotional. And he constantly puts out these metaphors that can be commented on or even challenged by Dr. Deng. And Dr. Deng comments on the importance of emotionality in response to this metaphor that Chuck's providing.
Yes.
but as you can see, even though I've been trying to keep a very tight grip and focus, this has been a deeply emotional or something running at this point in some sense.
Yes.
And so I don't know, but it's trying to find out how to make this journey now and how to make it in the way that will give Candy the most and stuff.
Yes. I'm actually very grateful that this is happening right now for all different reasons. One of them is really that life is happening this in this way. What I find really important is that in this emotionality, I think this is so much paired with our condition. It needs to be this emotionality, this in quotation mark Goodwin, try to hold a tight grip. Let's ask ourselves the question, what's the goal of holding a tight grip? It's not easy to find an answer, really.
No, one thing I do think, and I don't know if this is a tight grip or not, one is not to go into panic. And
So we can see how closely Dr. Deng is attuned to the emotionality in Chuck's talk. As he said in the lab when we were going over the tape later, getting a tight grip on my living towards dying can only happen if that other person helps me be in that space without feeling violated. It's a hugely vulnerable space for those participating. And when Dr. Deng asked him, what's the point of a tight grip suppressing emotionality? He says, it's appropriate. And this moved Chuck to have more focus, to articulate what really matters to him. And we can hear the shift in Chuck's voice and what we heard now from crying to modal voice. And I think that the work of Lynn Jacobs, a Gestalt psychologist, is insightful for understanding Dr. Deng's practice. She states that the development of a trajectory of patients rests in part on the quality of relational supports, the emotional availability of the doctor and the doctor-patient relationship. Emotional attunement and responsiveness, of course, are evident throughout Dr. Deng's practice. And what we find here then is co-shaped, co-emergent dialogue with both parties being emotionally available to one another. And Dr. Deng described to me his training 40 years ago in theories of Victor von Weizsäcker and the concept of Gestalt Christ, which is an elaboration of Gestalt psychology. Weizsäcker is known for his pioneering work in psychosomatic medicine and theories of medical anthropology. For him, biological events are not fixed responses, but are dependent upon previous experience and constantly being repatterned through experience. And Dr. D sees the patterns of communication between Chuck and himself as this shared conceptual and existential space. He says there's a shared not only existential space, but where dying is part of living, but also a conceptual space. Chuck's always thinking about what he's experiencing and documenting it. The ongoing curiosity that supersedes the dying experiences. This curiosity is in large part a huge element in what's taking place, in that spirit is possible to maintain the shared existential space. Otherwise, it's not possible. It's not an isolated human being that can pull this off. It needs to be a shared space, a solidarity of the human condition. Okay, so then what happens next is that Dr. Deng is going to offer his foundational theory of the unity of mind, body, and soul, and the importance of this for healing on the level of the body and the immune system. So he says, it's in the personhood, person, body, mind oneness, right? Where this directly has its corollary with what's going on in cancer. Chuck says, yeah. In other words, in living right now in all aspects has this direct healing aspects on what's going on. He wants Chuck to appreciate this in order for his healing to be even more profound. So he says, in other words, it's all in one, right? There's nothing left out. He wants Chuck to agree to this, but Chuck has a few other things to say. He interjects and provides his own ideas about what he thinks is relevant rather than this more abstract theory. He says, I'd only want to add one other thing, and it may not be for everybody, but for me, I really love Candy, and I've loved her ever since she first kissed me. So he says, I mean, the sense of not only accepting, but part of being present is this love that's very, very important, he says. And then he summarizes what's very important to him in this dialogue.
And I realize that in a way, it's the way I've lived my life, and it hasn't all been perfect, but I've given myself completely to Candy. I've never doubted. And I've also given myself to my students. So I think that's it. So at this point, I think that helps. I think if I have a lot of regrets, or I'd be in a different place. But I can, so when I say be in the present, that's the present I can return to. It's a present that's, full of love and care and the greatest happiness I've had and I'm still having. So that's important.
Okay, so he describes that how he has led his life dedicated to students and me, filled with love is what's important, having no regrets. And at this point, you might have heard the clicking of a camera. At this point, since I'm so interested in touch, and Dr. Deng reaches out and touches Chuck's hand, I get out my cell phone and start recording on video. And Dr. D transforms talking about the tight grip on emotions into an actual grip that anchors Chuck in this new space for facing and talking about death. And I want to capture this incredible moment where touch is as comforting and compassionate and healing as a parent's embrace of a child in the midst of trauma. So what now is going to happen is that Dr. Deng is going to provide his scenario of how Chuck can envision his life is not fading away, but rather is continuing on with the help of others who keep his vision alive.
Yes, yeah. And that is where the question becomes, what are the entities of importance in our living in this world, being in this world? It's on one hand, oneness in the abyss of emptiness, of the irreversible absence of the potential of living. On the other hand, it's the dyadic oneness of truth,
right,
in which all our transitionary being is in a way eternalized, because that other person carries me as a dyadic unit. Yeah. I am being in that other person. Right. That is a strange. Right. That is a strange phenomenon. Why do I conceive myself in my last hours in Federica's arms under the trees in Novida Place? Yeah. Just fading away in her arms. Yeah.
So Dr. Deng commented in a seminar that as he's saying this, he's imagining his own death. Chuck is talking about his, and he describes this scenario of dying in his partner's arms in a hypothetical story, just fading away in Novita Place where he lives. And that then the demonstration of understanding of this story is that it actually became a vision of how Chuck would die in my arms. Dr. Deng elaborates his vision of a life persisting in a transformed way as part of a bigger whole. Chuck agrees, but he has one concern and one hesitation for me being alone. He says, let's see, oops, okay. There's something making this temporary being part of a larger whole that's transformed, that persists in a transformed way. Then he says, yes, it does. The only slight thing is I hate to leave Candy alone. And then what he's going to do is that he's going to carry further his interpretation of Dr. Deng's talk for how his life will persist in a transformed way, invoking Day of the Dead, which is joyful. The dead don't disappear, they're present. He invokes the writings and figure of Gregory Bateson, whose works continues to stimulate people despite his absence. And then he talks about living through his students.
And and in a way I can see, I think I would have been more devastated if she was the one who was dying, because I wouldn't quite know how to be alone. And maybe there's a way to try to figure this. And maybe that's, I don't know, and it may not be, because I'm not sure there's any time. But that sense of people in the Day of the Dead, there's a presence. I mean, Bateson said, because of all the ideas, that he didn't completely disappear. Because you read Bateson and you still, in a way, there is this stuff. And, we're coming up to our retirement. And to some extent, I lived through my students too. I mean, we've all had that, but that's maybe saying too much.
So in this encounter, then, Chuck is going to describe Dr. Deng as his guide, his Virgil, guiding him on this voyage and living towards death.
And I realize I'm taking you beyond what's required for you as a heart doctor. You're becoming more general. I mean, the metaphor I had is not so bad. It's like a Virgil in the Divine Comedy, guiding Dante through this horrible voyage to hell.
So Dr. Deng engages the patient in building a future narrative, carefully listening and recruiting what's relevant in Chuck's life and anchoring it in possibilities for a cohesive sense of self, facing death as a part of living. Now, on multiple occasions, this is the same month, a little bit later, Chuck continued to engage in interactions with his larger community. This is a retirement party where he had the opportunity to express his deep gratitude for interactions with colleagues and students. It was a way of saying goodbye to the larger community.
And that we've been part of this incredible community, all of you. And I see this as a community, you could say thinking, but that's too dead. A community trying to look intensely at what it is to be human. A community that we grow and build from each other, both intellectually and personally.
Then 10 months later, in February, the cancer had spread throughout his body and immune embolization had failed, and he's writing to his colleagues about this. He says, I can't shut my mind off from getting new ideas about interaction and incredible interest in the world. Then there'd been this Festschrift that was created for him. Within 3 months, over 50 colleagues wrote pieces about how Chuck's work had influenced their own. And this has been sent to him while he was in a hospital in Philadelphia. And he said, the Festschrift meant so much to me, and in particular, the way so many people caught the joy of my lab and my great enthusiasm for engaging with and learning from others, as well as the wonderful theoretical syntheses such as yours. This is simply part of our continuing exchanges to bring you up to date and to let you know I'm still very much with you and for so many wonderful colleagues. This is the emails he's sending out. And then he writes, invoking Shakespeare once again, I'm entering the world that Hamlet described as engendering dread, the undiscovered country from whose bourne no traveler returns. I have at least 1 foot in that territory and want to report what I find. I do not think that what I write is grim, but reports of the work to inhabit a joyous presence and experience it fully, not in the abstract, but as daily experience. This is motivated by a strong desire to sustain rather than joy, rather than fear for Candy. I want to leave a record of what I'm experiencing and hope it might be useful to others. If not, no problem. I'm beginning to see inhabiting the present with love as one of the tasks of a life in a way I never did before. And then he updates his students on what's happening. His tumors are getting larger, no treatments are pointless, but he still wants to meet with his lab. And he says, I love it, it sustains me. And this is how I feel in my relationship with you. I've always talked and enthusiastically exchanged ideas. I hope some of these will continue to grow in their own ways in your work, not copying or citing, but as part of a continuing dialogue and exchange. I want all of you from whom I've learned so much to continue in your own diverse paths and hopefully approach both the materials you're working with and the lives of people in them with a sense of awe and wonder and joy at discovering the richness of what they're doing, he says. And then on reflecting on this, a student wrote me later about the importance of this. I remember when I started reading this message, I thought that it was finally it. But Chuck wanted to keep meeting with the lab and wanted to be dying in the midst of other ongoing life. He was showing us that being part of an ongoing community that lives on without you, your own death becomes less tragic. So the message brings together a lot of themes in Chuck's earlier messages: gratitude, taking control of how you look at things, being in the present and celebrating being with those you love, and having a deep wonder and openness for all human experiences, including dying. I am honored and grateful to have gotten to learn these lessons about dying firsthand from Chuck. As an academic mentor, Chuck apprenticed us into the study of social interaction, but through these messages, he became a mentor on dying, which she says is a rare gift. Then what was truly important to us were messages that I received from dear friend, we received from Lourdes de Leon, who does work in Mexico and Mayan culture for over 30 years. And so she wanted to share what she was experiencing on going into this home of her comadre who had passed, and what was happening there. She had this comadre, her granny had developed melanoma in the skin, but she refused to go to the hospital, staying at home instead with family and friends and taking care of children and seeing each other. And her life expired not in a hospital, but in the midst of ongoing life. And she expresses this kind of peaceful, tender feeling inhabiting the house where she was with all the people there. And then she described going to the cemetery. The walk from home to the cemetery was smooth as velvet, with a sense of equanimity and acceptance and presence. I was struck by a very strong feeling of being all together, us with her. And then she talks about bringing offerings for 40 days, the Day of the Dead, a very natural way of keeping with the loved one without feeling the abrupt separation we have in our own culture, she says. And she comments, I thought of Chuck in the context of his own culture, and I strongly feel that we also have a strong, loving community keeping both him and Candy company. This is crystal clear, among other manifestations in the magnificent book just edited by Don Favreau in concert with a large web of people who honor Chuck and thank him for his many gifts to our community. This is one of the offerings that show you are always with us forever, dear Chuck. I will add to this gift my strong desire of having a shrine for Chuck on the Day of the Dead with my Mayan family, she says. I will speak your name and light candles for you as long as I am here in this world. And as you walk in the mountain where the spirits meet, we will pray for you and ask you to wait for us, who will be meeting with you in time and beyond time to rejoice eternally. And this is the offering, an example of the offering that she had for Chuck that year. So shortly after Lourdes wrote that note in February, we had a surprise party for Chuck on March 2nd, and people came from Singapore, Japan, various places in the US to be with him. And there was clearly a collective effervescence on seeing Chuck's happiness. He was being handed with this festschrift that that was somehow put together in 3 months as a dedication to him. And stories about the peaceful death in Lourdes' notes provided his vision of how to die. So we see a sense of reuse with transformation of stories in the story that Chuck is now going to tell his friends gathered at this surprise party.
And the other thing I really want to say, and here I'm relying on what Lourdes said about the death of her compadre, I am so happy to see the children here today too, because I envision, I told you this, and I'm not trying to be dark, but instead of my life fading out all by myself, like in a hospital room, I envision when my life finally fades out, it fading out in a scene like this that's filled with the life of others, with all sorts of generations. And that seems to be the world that we inhabit, rather than a private world of, pain and death, but a world that is sustained through the richness of other people and their care, concern, intellectual stimulation. And it's the most wonderful thing. Okay, I'll stop.
So Chuck continued to meet with the seminar the last week of his life, though it was now in the bedroom rather than the lab. And neighbors and hiking friends came to visit him in his last week when he was mostly in bed. His sister Pat is over there on the extreme right. She's a hospice nurse, and she came to live with us for a month and then stayed for 3 weeks afterwards, after the death. So it's just a lovely transition. And stories about a peaceful death in Lourdes' letters provided a vision on how to die. Then a year later, in 2019, he was honored by receiving the Sapir Book Prize for best work in linguistic anthropology during the last 2-year period. And I'll just read you something from philosopher Megan Craig. She states, the author dies the moment the writing leaves her hands and goes out in the world. Yet the text itself has the possibility of being animated by readers beyond any single biological or measurable lifetime. And really, in the presentations that we see in the lab now and in the Festschrift and at the Boulder Society for Linguistic Anthropology meetings that we're honoring Chuck, we see that these ideas are continuously being animated in different ways. He received also the Distinguished Book Award from Ethno and CA section of ASA. And now passages from Being Peace by Thich Nhat Hanh provided a vision of Chuck always being with us. A friend of mine has been taking care of her 93-year-old mother. The doctors say her mother will die any day. Recently, she told her mother, this body is not actually yours. Your body is much larger. My friend continued, when you were young, you were able to teach many people how to cook and do many other things. You made people happy. Now we are doing the same thing. We are continuing the work you have begun. When you were young, you wrote poetry and sang, and now many of us write poems and sing beautifully. You are continuing in us. You are many beings at the same time. This is the meditation on non-self. It helps her mother see that her body is just a small part of her true self. She understands that when her body departs, she will continue in many other forms. And we see here that it did continue. Chuck's work did continue in many different forms. This is his Cooperative Action Lab continuing. And it transitioned to Zoom with the onset of the pandemic. And then with weekly exchanges, there were new possibilities for collaboration across 5 continents that keep emerging. Lourdes's ideas lingered. And here's an altar that I have in my kitchen where Chuck is remembered. And here we see Norma Mendoza-Denton and her daughter, Maggie, preparing to sing Remember Me from Coco. And I'll just leave you with what Mario Deng, the doctor, said, the gift of making his dying as part of our living. allows us to remember his dying not as a denial of living now, but as a condition of living now more richly. And that becomes a universal concept of being human. And just one last thought from Megan Craig. We need education about stages of dying, knowing what to fear and what not to fear. With technological handling of death, often we are not in touch with dying people. But more than additional knowledge, we need practice in being there with others in their suffering and through their circumstances. When all the knowledge in the world will not change a thing, we need ongoing practice in being emotional and responsive. Practice that would begin and be grounded in early childhood. Okay, thank you very much. And we invite everyone to join our, we have a lab that meets from 10 to 12 every Wednesday. There's the password, and if you'd like to know about it, and there's a website that's this new lab website that has all of Chuck's writings, as well as 4 videotaped talks that he's given. So it's another way to put you in touch with Chuck. Okay, thank you. So
Thank you very much, Candy. I'm sure it's a little bit hard to ask questions after such a touching talk, but I will anyway open the floor. But I think that we open the floor not only for questions and comments, but if anybody wants to say anything about or to ask Candy anything about her research or Chuck, I think Candy will be glad to talk a little bit, or even share maybe something personal, because yeah.
should I stop sharing? Should I stop sharing?
Yeah, so we can see.
I'm trying to do it, but it's hard to do it right here. I'm having, can you do it?
Let me see.
I'm trying.
Yeah, I can do it. Yeah.
Okay, good. Okay.
Nils, you had some comments in the chat. Would you like to say it loud?
It's difficult to speak, frankly, but yeah, I just wanted to thank you very much for the talk, and giving an opportunity to think about continuity, persistence, community, the embeddedness of human lives in each other. It's hard to articulate, but it is very, very meaningful for me, and it is also sensible as a practice, not just as a statement, but as a communal achievement of this continuity. And yeah, all I wanted to say. Thank you very much for giving this opportunity and being in this position to feel it, to perceive it.
Thank you very much, Niels. I love all your comments all the time in our lab. It's great to have you part of it. Yes. Yeah.
I wanted also to thank you very much, Candy, for sharing the story. And I think it's second time I hear. The first time was at Lancy in fall, and I was crying all the time, and together with all the people around me, and sympathizing, empathizing on so many levels with the story. Yeah, I think it's super important that you keep this message, and it helps the living to come to terms with the idea of death, and show some good practices of living with death, you know, some best practices of how to live with death. And personally, I find it's very hard, but also so important, this idea of like staying with the trouble of another person, staying with someone, with the pain and uncertainty, and yeah, this complex feelings involved in another person's complicated experience such as pain or death, and like just being there with the person, you know, not leaving the person, but being there with them. I think it's so important, and I'd love to learn this skill myself, you know, more, not to turn around, turn away from someone who is suffering, but just being there, sharing this space. Yeah. This is what your story is teaching me.
Oh, thank you, Sasha. Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, I want to kind of open it up too, to in CA thinking more about emotional features of life and not just epistemology. How we experience, what the experience of life is like, and so that's one of the reasons why I think it's important to talk about this.
Ilya?
Yeah. I just wanted to say thank you for this presentation, and I just wanted to highlight also how amazed am I that you've managed to turn such a personal matter into, I know, a story that we can all grow from. And I also wonder, how have you managed to do this? Because I believe not all of us can speak about, let's say, sensitive topics, and I believe that this has been very, very personal for you, and yet you've managed to open up and make this so, I know, important for a lot of people.
Thank you for that comment. It is very therapeutic to work through these tapes and to hear Chuck's voice all the time, I have to say. Yeah, so thank you. Yeah, it is hard at points, but I feel so much that Chuck's always with us, that it's a way of being with him and celebrating his life, be working on these materials, and Federica and Mario are wonderful collaborators, and so we can go over these materials and learn new things all the time, talking to one another, and having the insights of the doctor and Federica's insights as a phenomenologist really helps to bring everything together. So I'm so grateful to be working with them, I have to say. They couldn't be here today, but their work is so important to me and to this enterprise. Yes. Yeah.
Veniamin, you had a comment in the chat. Would you like to say it out loud?
Yes, of course. It was also more of a comment than a question. It's just that while listening, I couldn't help but compare the story in the presentation to the Plato's dialogue Phaedo, in which Socrates gradually approaches death while simultaneously lives in the moment. And I think that it's just, well, the earliest example of such way of tackling death that we know. And I wonder if this example in Plato's Phaedo was as important to Chuck or to you as much as many other literary examples of living towards death that he points out.
He never mentioned that. I was, but I find it very relevant as well. So I'm so glad to have had this opportunity to talk to you about it. Do you want to say something more? It's a beautiful, beautiful thought, I think.
It's just that I could directly.
Oh, let me just say one. Well, I just want to say one other thing. Chuck's major in college he was an English major. So he was reading Shakespeare continuously, often, whatever. I mean, if he could have, he would have done a CA class in Shakespeare, and some of his work. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, that was a very beautiful explanation. Yeah, perhaps if he majored in classics, we would hear some more of Plato's examples. Yeah.
Yes.
It's not that I couldn't link it directly, but I couldn't help but notice that there is this similarity, and I haven't found yet what exactly the similarity is, but I will continue to think about it.
Please write me. This is such a beautiful thought. Yeah.
Of course. Thank you so much.
Yeah. 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 He was constantly, even on when being wheeled to the next operation, he was constantly talking with the anesthesiologist about the practice of anesthesiology. and he was constantly wondering and curious about each aspect of the process. Very interesting. This kind of engagement, as Dr. Deng talked about. Being curious about what was going on.
Sophia?
Yeah, I just wanted to kindly ask you to quickly round up the conclusion part of your report, because I think I missed some part of it. So reading through the topic of your report, I was expecting some kind of strategy of coping with inevitability of death. And on Chuck's example, I can see that he had a lot of conversations with his doctor, with people that were surrounding him. Are you telling that this is exactly the strategy, or is there something more to it?
Well, he's constantly talking to his students, getting their responses, constantly talking openly about death. I think that's like one of the major things I'd like to present here, that by being open, you help other people to understand that death is inevitable, and to begin to accept it more as something in your own life. And so part of the process, it was a very interactive process, in other words, that he would tell other people how he was experiencing things, I mean, quite openly and vividly at points, and they would come back with their reactions. And so it was providing this community of shared understanding about what the end of life was about. And I think that by talking about it more and more and becoming more open, he was able to understand death as a part of living. I would say that is the practice. I don't know if you had some other questions about that, but Mandy?
Yeah, thank you, Candy, so much for talking about this. It is a bit emotional, so I'll be very quick. Just to sort of add to what you're saying there and to that discussion, is that I was there as a visiting lecturer. I remember when it was all going on. And just as you're saying about him being a mentor to us, talking so openly about death and going through it with him and with you, and how amazing Federica and her wonderful husband were, and all of those things. And that's the lived experience, I think, isn't it? And you know, like Maria was saying earlier about the bond that we all have from the lab, and it's just about treasuring those experiences as you go through life. And I think for me, that's the legacy that he leaves, and you carry it with you, you know, in that dyad, as you were saying, Candy, you know, you carry him and all those stories with you. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. And I like Neil's comment. He says, a sense of, Niels, do you want to say what you're thinking? Yeah.
I'm kind of still a bit speechless. I mean, it's not again because Lancy, I heard this before, but it's still very difficult to engage. But yeah, I'm thinking about intertwined symbiosis. I'm thinking about living together, the community of shared experience in vulnerability and care, and furnishing this sense of living together as a practice. It's not just a set of I think rules about how an individual is supposed to engage this, but actually relocating death into a shared experience, suffused with continuity and not supporting a sense of continuity through this practice. I can't really, as Maria says, we inhabit each other's actions, and that speaks a lot to me. That this is a relocation of the privacy of death to lived, loving community. Sorry if this is a bit,
No, it seems so appropriate, everything you're saying. Yeah. And, and to openly cry and be emotional, but yeah, in a very loving way. Yeah, I think that's great.
And I love, Candy, that you brought Lord S in as well, and thinking about how death is celebrated in other cultures. And I know after coming back from living in New Zealand for a long time, and the Maori culture, and that they stay with their departed for a long time, they have family coming and going, and it's the stark separation sometimes that I think is a very scary part of death, isn't it? So learning from other cultures as well about how we cope with living with death through these different ways, I think is so rich. And our like Nils is saying, that shift in perspective of how we see death or how we treat death. And I like that you said about early childhood education as well, and how, because for me it's not talked about enough, and as soon as death comes up it's closed down immediately. And the only time I've ever seen any kind of talk about death is where in a very, very rural community in New Zealand, a child had brought in a possum that had been knocked over on the road, and the teachers talked about it and talked about its death, and had it on the craft table, and set up easels around it for the children to paint pictures of this dead possum, and had a conversation. That's the one time only in my entire life that I've ever seen that embraced. And so I absolutely agree, it should be talked about more a lot. Yeah. And that shift in perspective. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I have a question comment in the chat, which I will read aloud because Nikolai is not able to speak now. It is hard to imagine how such phenomena can be exhibited with the detailed video analysis methods. And on the contrary, they were so organically shown with ethnography, as if only by telling the whole story, the necessary context is provided for having at least relative understanding of the phenomenon. What do you think about this comment?
Okay, meaning that, yeah, okay, I want to completely understand. Maria, give your interpretation first, so then I'll come in.
As far as I understood, Nikolai is asking about the difference of video analysis versus ethnography. So is it possible to study such phenomena only by relying on video, not making ethnographic investigations? But I'm not sure I got it right. Caller, please write in the chat if we are missing the point.
Okay, it seems to me that we do need an ethnography of this lived experience rather than, I mean, I have the detailed conversations, many, but putting them together with how Chuck is emotionally experiencing things, I think is what makes it more vivid to people, and provides some sort of more heartfelt experience, which is what I'm aiming at, rather than just here's this story and here's a second story. Although those are the mechanisms through which intersubjectivity can be obtained. Yeah, I think, the ethnography, I hope that I provided enough ethnography here. Yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to add. I think one. It's about the embedding about these things because what I found to be very powerful was actually showing that moment of touch, where touching each other in a kind of metaphorical sense goes to this embodied caring touch of the doctor. I forgot the name. And I think that it would be that we would lose a lot about the embodied ecological nature of these kinds of interactions if it were an ethnography without visual documentation, without seeing how it is embedded in this rich environment.
Oh, thank you, Niels. That's beautifully said. Yes, I think so as well. And we're just lucky that we have moments of Chuck during that. We have many more moments during that surprise party that was given for him, where he's talking very eloquently about the meaning of his friendships and dialogue with other people for his own sense of being. So I think, yeah, so it's hard to think about how to, we're trying to write this up, of course, in some way. So it takes a long time. But are you saying that without the video, it really wouldn't have the same sort of impact in some way?
I think something would be definitely lost. I'm not sure. I'm thinking about Ways of the Hand of Sadno, I think, right? His account of learning how to become an accompanying jazz pianist, and that is such a vivid, ethnographic, deep, phenomenologically rich account. But I'm thinking that videographic methods embedded in a broader ethnography can recover something about the environmental, spatial bodies through time. It can do something with temporality and space in a vivid way that is important to preserve.
Okay, thank you. Very good. And I wonder if Igor can speak to his chat. Igor?
Igor, are you still here?
I'm sorry, yeah, I'm not in, so yeah, I wrote everything in the chat. So yeah, I tried to move this all back to the topic of conversations from existential dimension. Yeah, and well, I put it this way. We take the speech act theory, and 3 types of speech acts exist: the locutionary, illocutionary, and allocutionary acts. And normally all the conversations and with all these 3 speech acts combined. Yeah, we end our story, we wanted to tell, we say goodbye, and then we leave or turn off the phone. Yeah, and well, I tried to make the comparison with conversation and life. Yeah, we saw the finishing of the story. Yeah, he finished all that he wanted to do. Perlocutionary, he could no longer live. Yeah, and the most problematic part here, to end the life completely or like in a proper way. I'm not speaking very fun right now because the story is very emotional and I'm very touched. Sorry. Yeah, so I think all of this investigation is really about how to meaningfully end the life with proper elocutions that, yeah, it's better put in the text than I said it. Yeah.
Okay, go ahead.
Sorry.
Thank you very much. Very insightful comments. Yeah. The thing is, we kept learning from other people about how to experience the end of life, you know, from the doctor saying he would like, his hypothetical story, he'd like to die in his partner's arms, and Lourdes's note about having the entire community involved in the dying. And Chuck did die in my arms, and we were together for about 3 hours before I told him, it was the middle of the night, before I told my sister-in-law that he had died. And it was a very loving way to end, just to tell you, you know, to be with another person so completely. And yeah. I must say, the way that we worked together, the way that Chuck was always with me in my writing and everything, was so important for me as a scholar. I don't know. I have to tell you that it was like a true union of souls to the very end. Yeah. But any other questions or comments? I mean, it's so helpful to me. Anything that people have on their mind, I'm really so open, because I want to know what would be the best way to present this, let's say, in written form. I thought about starting with the surprise party and talking about the joy that Chuck had, and then questioning, well, how is it that he came to inhabit this kind of a person, way of being in the world, you know, in the face of near death? I don't know. I'm thinking about that as a way to begin, rather than the way that I did today. So it's an issue. So I'm really grateful for any kind of comments about structuring the presentation of this for other people, and what you think is effective or not. Somebody has their hand
Yeah,
up. Yes.
Evgeny.
Yes. First of all, I would like to say thank you very much for this beautiful presentation and story. And that's very inspiring in a way that, you know, time to time you face with a thing that you want to help to a person that is very, very important and close to you. I mean, to help him to change something in his life. And I mean, to help him to struggle with problems he's got. And in a time we fed up and we give up. I mean, and the story that you showed, this shows like it's very inspiring that you've gone through the whole way, like from the beginning till the end, and to see the whole transformation that's gone. It's very valuable, and it's a very good lesson, like for me personally, how to tackle the same things when I understand that it's not even close to what you have experienced, but when I'm trying like to help my friends, to help my family to struggle with something and to be close, and it's very, very valuable. And I've got like not a comment but a question. I mean, from one of the last pages, when there was thought, when, you know, like the body is a small part of being. I mean, there is a soul and there is another part, and this all very very close to the idea of, you know, the transformation of personality of a person in Hindu mythology, in meditation. I mean, and this is like, I mean, in methodological way, how can we, I mean, to measure this transformation? I mean, what Niels has written, his first comment, I mean, from this is something that happened to him, I mean, this is who he is. I mean, after the transformation, after he has understood that, like, or probably not, but after he transformed into something else. I mean, is it possible if we are as researchers of these cases or cases as, like, I mean, if we want to study, for example, how this transformation happens in people who practice any sort of like meditation or something, is there anything we could methodologically understand that this transformation just happened and it's like something changed or something like that? So, yeah.
What would you say? By the way, Buddhist thought pervades Dr. Deng's practice. Lourdes de Leon is a practicing Buddhist, although she's like a Mayan Buddhist. So our philosophy was that a kind of Mayan Buddhist philosophy, I say. I don't know, just to make things a little bit more concrete. Yeah, but so what is your question then? Again, and what would your answer be?
I don't know, actually. I mean, there should be like some sides, I guess, that we could see, I mean, and understand by like observing and like researching that. Or so, and so like where was the point probably where you or like understood that this transformation in his life had happened? I mean, so he has got used to the thought or to his being that it is not just what's happening to him, but this is a part of his life. It's part of him. So.
Mm-hmm. I thought that all the time, and Dr. Deng kept bringing up about how Chuck, I don't know if this is getting into what you want to say, but would be living on through other people, you know, and he said that from almost the very beginning because he had read Chuck's work and knew about it, and so that was always my thought. And when Chuck's body was taken away by the I forget what kind of society or something, but my sister-in-law was sobbing and crying, but for me, I was not. I thought that, you know, Chuck, the important thing about Chuck is his spirit, his life, his writings, his very being in our minds. So it wasn't the body, it wasn't a kind of turmoil for me, because I knew that Chuck was living on through other people. So I don't know if that explains it, but it's really hard for people to grasp that that was my reaction at the time when his body was the Neptune Society, it was, to be cremated. But it wasn't sad for me, because, you know, I came to accept too that people die, but the wonderful way that people in the lab are continuing his work, and so, I mean, I see that he's a constant inspiration for a lot of people. So that to me is the important thing about who a person is. Does that explain something?
Yeah,
I don't know.
Very much. Yes.
But I'm not sure if that got it. but I'm glad, I'm grateful that you asked that question, just because, you know, I did want to talk about the Buddhist element to all of this in some way. Yes, Sasha.
Yes, I wanted to also say a couple of things. So
First of all, I really appreciate how Candy, you and I felt it a lot in Charles Goodwin's work too. How you bring your full selves into what you're doing. It's not just. I mean, I think the things that you're writing about, it's not only an intellectual curiosity or epistemological issue, but I feel your full, like whole-bodied, embodied presence in what you're doing. And that's when I first started reading Charles Goodwin's works, that's the feeling that I got from it, that his stakes are very real. Like it's like for him it's the matter of life and death, actually, like the way he writes about like the competencies of chill, right? Or so this is the real stake. It's not just something that's distantly or like that's tickling my imagination or my intellectual curiosity. It's real. It's real in this existential sense. So I think for me, your work is an example of how this can be done in this type of research can be done in academic settings where the mind and body, or like the mind and all these affective existential dimensions are separated, and the borders are kept like strictly like divided, right? So this is about my research work. This is about me as a person. So yeah, and I feel you are so really moving, like crossing this boundary, and this is beautiful because I feel because this boundary exists, we have so much research that objectifies people, or that does harm because it's done without heart, it's done without the real stakes of the real existential stakes of people we're writing about, like me personally. So this component of I'm not sure if I'm finding the right words, but I feel, yeah, in a lot of what you're saying and you're writing, I feel your full-bodied and full existential presence. That's what's very valuable to me. Yeah.
Oh, that was so beautiful. Thank you so much. That was really very beautiful statement. Thank you so much.
Yeah, and also, yeah, Candy, I was just saying, I was thinking that a lot about I'm thinking a lot about the topic of care and like what constitutes good care. And I think your experience as a caregiver is also very interesting in this journey that you were sharing with and still sharing with Charles. So you mostly focus on his experience, but I feel like, yeah, what you are saying, what your experience is very valuable to me too. Yeah.
Well, I feel nourished by all the people that I interact with. That's all I can say. I don't know, it's like this give and take constantly. And it's just a wonderful kind of experience and interacting with all of you now. Thank you so much for this opportunity. It's real. I mean, this was the most heartfelt discussion I think I've ever had. I really appreciate it, and all the comments that everybody had, and I'm definitely going to copy the chat myself, not trusting on any technology, because this is invaluable, everybody's comments. And so gratifying. But I hope that we all can, move to dealing more with the emotional as well as other concerns in ethno-CA more and more. That would be my hope. Yeah, in some way, which Mandy is doing in her work with. And you are doing, Sasha, and yeah, what we saw today. Really great.
Thank you so much, Candy. We are so glad to have you here, and it was just so heartwarming and touching to listen to you and to listen to Chuck speaking. So I don't think words will help me to finish this session. I'll just send hearts in the emoji.
Good, good. And I want this to be continuing dialogue. So if people have ideas for me, what would be the best way to write this up, as a book. And, I have lots and lots of stories, but I can't imagine people wanting to look through like 300 pages of stories, so.
Maybe one of our labs, one of our next labs has to be all about you, Candy, instead of everybody else for a change. That's what we need to do.
Okay, but thank you, everybody. Thank you. Really appreciate the chance.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Candy. I just want to mention one more time that we are really glad that you're here with us today and delivering this speech about Chuck and his heritage. Thank you very much for that.
And let me just say one other thing, just as a practical note, is, I get so much out of being able to listen to his voice and everything. As a project, all of you might try documenting your families so that you will always have a record of them interacting with you, because there's something just very calming about, being able to listen to the person, and people forget about this. It's just, it's a practical project that you could do in your own family. It's just a suggestion, but.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah. That's wonderful.
Okay.